Video, I'm going to go over how to do assessment with couples. And just a disclaimer, I am not good at couples counseling. I say that joke every semester because it's true. But I love going over this section. And in another video separate from this one, I'm going to show you how to do an Imago workup. And that's a fun little thing to do with couples, especially if they need help trying to figure out what's going on, what kind of cycles they have occurring in their relationship. So I hope you enjoy that. That's something that you can do with yourself. I wish we could do it together because for a lot of people, it's kind of surprising. So I think you'll enjoy it. I hope you like this presentation over how to work with couples. So let's dive in. So there are a few standardized instruments for couples work. And this is one of those things that you can use these standardized instruments to kind of get a baseline for the couple that you're working with. They're really useful to use at the beginning of your counseling relationship with them. When they come in and they're going over the informed consent paperwork and the demographic stuff, and you're collecting all that information, you slide one of these into that introductory packet, and this gives you a snapshot of what that relationship looks like. It's trying to quantify what that relationship is and how it works. The key word here, though, is that it's a snapshot, right? It's how they are then. Remember, when people go to counseling, there's usually something not quite right. A couple doesn't usually go to counseling if everything's fine. So we're not expecting to see super high scores. It's not impossible. They might be coming in for a specific issue or a joint issue, such as a death in the family. The takeaway that I want you to remember is that these scales are trying to quantify the quality and nature of a relationship, which is inherently a very subjective thing, but it is a good tool to use for you to kind of get an idea of where they're at, and also using the specific questions on those surveys, right? Because it gets the couple thinking about, well, how do we communicate? Or, yeah, I do think our values are very different. So if nothing else, they serve as a good way of starting the couples counseling process. And these are easily found online. I will post some in Blackboard. Now, the really fun part is the informal assessments. Excuse me. Trying to understand how they communicate, getting their relationship history, and then individual history. Communication sample, as you can imagine, the majority of issues that couples come in for either revolve around or include an element of poor communication. And it could be one person doesn't listen very well or hear very well, the other person doesn't speak or relay their needs or wants very well. You could get the perfect combination of a person who doesn't listen being in a relationship with someone who doesn't speak very well or share very well. And so how do we understand how a couple communicate? One way is just through direct observation in session, right? When you pose questions, invariably what happens is there will be some question where the couple disagrees or they have different interpretations of the answer, right? You might say, well, tell me about the last big argument the two of you had. And one person says, oh, well, it was just the other day, we got into a big fight over buying name brand soda versus store brand soda. And the other person says, what are you talking about? That was like, yeah, we disagreed on it. But the last big argument was a month ago when we talked about making sure you lock the car doors at night, and I got so angry and there was yelling. And so you're watching them communicate in real time. You're kind of watching them have an argument. And so that gives you an idea of how they communicate. Is there one person who's dominating? Is there, conversely, someone who's very passive? Do you hear raised voices? Do you see really respectful communication? right? And so another thing that you can do is also give them a task to solve. And this is, of course, contingent on you having, the space and time to do this. But giving a small problem or riddle or some kind of objective that they have to work together to resolve. So I always think it would be kind of a neat test to take a couple, if we, if in a, this is one of those dream or thought experiments. If I was doing couples counseling and I really wanted to see how they got along, how they communicated, could I put them like in a escape room type situation and observe them, right? Where I'm not right there in the middle of it all. And then I could just watch and see what happens. Is there's one person who takes the lead and they're overpowering the other person? Is there one person who keeps trying to interject but is never heard? Do they work very well together when there's a single identifiable goal? And so, think about what activities you could do with a couple that would help you understand how they communicate. Each relationship has a different communication style. Oh, that's what I just went over. How about that? So, follow-up questions for communication samples include, is this typical? Is this the way, if I'm your counselor, I'm asking, is this how you guys usually communicate? Is this normal? Is this how you communicate for everything? Or is it only in times of disagreement or only in times where there's a lot of pressure? Because when you're in the counseling session, the person, it's typical for them to feel maybe a little pressured or a little vulnerable. But is this what happens at home? What was difficult about that task? What was good about it? Right? Because I want to see if I'm trying to figure out if what I'm observing is what happens at home. This helps establish a pattern for me. And once I identify this pattern, then we can figure out, is the pattern the issue? Is there something that keeps driving the pattern? Where was the tipping point? And this is a really important question. Every argument that has ever happened follows the same routine, right? Things were fine, and then one person hits their tipping point, and that's when they start raising their voice, even if it's just a little bit. And then the other person picks up on that, and now they react to it, and maybe they start raising their voice. So now the next person says, oh no, and now they get sarcastic. And then we go, so at what point did it tip over from having direct, even-keeled communication, even if we're disagreeing, into an argument where we're kind of bickering, if not completely arguing with one another? The 8 C's, and certainly this is not something you need to commit to memory. This is not, and it's also not anything that's on the NCE. This is all just kind of practical stuff. These are the main aspects of couples counseling that you want to explore that can come up. And certainly it's not an exhaustive list. We covered communication. Once you've established that pattern, we then need to figure out, where does it break down? Where does communication end? And typically what we'll see is when there's an argument, when things get heated, that's when it starts falling apart. But when you really look at how communication happens with couples, there's 3 pieces. There's the person speaking, the sender. That's the person trying to make their point. There's the receiver, so the person who's not speaking but is listening, ideally, or the person that the sender is trying to communicate to. And then there's a bunch of stuff in between. Processing, and this might be things that you're familiar with, when we think about communication, there are those people who process out loud, right? Perhaps you are that person, or someone who does this. And so when they're talking, or when they're thinking out loud. So how does that come across to the partner, right? If I was just talking, kind of rambling, imagine if we were in class together and you asked me a question. Typically what I think I do is I kind of look off in the distance and I think about my response. Sometimes I'll say I need a second and then I give my answer. But if I start talking out loud, just sort of rambling or sharing my thoughts, you're hearing that and you might think, oh, that's his response to my question. Same thing in relationships. If there's a person who is talking out loud, the receiver might not know this is just their style of thinking and processing, and instead think they're talking to me right now and I don't know what to do with this. The internal processor is someone who they take a second. That's kind of what I just described. If we were in a live class, they might wait and they say, I need to collect my thoughts. And then they share that. Now, the flip side of it, because one is not bad and one is not better, right? It's about identifying them. The internal processor, what can happen is that one person is talking to them and they say, what do you think about A, B, and C? Or why did you do this? And the internal processor, from their perspective, they're taking a second and they're thinking, what do I think about that? And they're kind of putting the pieces together and they don't want to speak too soon. But to the other person, it looks like they're not engaged, right? And so as a counselor, that's the stuff that you're pointing out, right? Because one person might say, they're always talking, they're always throwing words at me, I don't know what they want. Or they might say, he's never engaged, he just sits there, he just stares at me. And so as a counselor, you're in there trying to point out, well, no, it's not that he's not engaged. That's how he thinks. That's how he's processing. And if we give him a minute, then you get this really well thought out response. And on the flip side, it's no, this person is not throwing every thought your way. That's how they process things. They're not necessarily expecting you to respond to everything they're saying. So the 4 horsemen of communication. So this is where problems come up. These are the problems that you will typically see, and these are concepts that come from Gottman, and so he is a very, very I'm blanking on the word. I'm gonna go with famous family and couples therapist. Lots of just fascinating stuff. No pun intended. Very valid and reliable methods of communication. But if you're interested in couples counseling, I highly suggest just while you're at UTSA, go to the online library and check out some of Gottman's stuff. And he's got videos. Very brilliant clinician, lots of wonderful information. So this was his concept for how communication fails with couples. And again, why does this tie to assessment? We are trying to figure out which of these, or which combination of these is happening, where it's happening, and why it's happening. So see, it wasn't all coefficients and standard deviations in the end. So criticism typically comes from the person who's sending the message, and it contains some sort of judgment or evaluation, right? So this is someone who's being critical, and it's not just the content. And this is where I think couples really struggle. This is where my heart goes out to them, is that somebody, if you read a transcript of their conversation, you don't see anything inherently critical or even hurtful. However, the tone or the manner in which it was communicated has the criticism, right? If someone who's being very sarcastic, or they're mocking or something like that. But this is someone who says, oh, you're late again, right? It's not the pointing out that someone's late. It's the tone of, I'm getting tired of this. You're wearing that. You've been on the computer a lot lately, right? So it's all about tone, and it feels critical. And whether it's tone or content, the principle that there's some criticism, how do people respond to that criticism, right? And so that typically makes the other person feel very defensive, and then it goes from there. The sender may not know that's how it's coming across, and they might not intend it. The receiver their sensitivity meter might be turned all the way up. And so the sender is actually saying everything in a cool, calm voice, but the other person feels that they're being critical. Contempt. So this is someone who, we're seeing frustration. This one is definitely more observable. It's a little more concrete. And it also conveys judgment, right? And it's usually a response to the sender. So in this case, the person who says, you're on your computer a lot lately, or you're playing more video games. And even if the criticism is not there, the contempt that the sender shows might show up as, the big sigh, and then here we go. The folding of arms, I have a coaster in my hand. I'm going to see if my mic can pick up the noise, but you're playing a lot of video games and you hear the person go, and they put down the controller, right? It's signaling that I'm upset with you, but it's doing it in a way that causes a disconnect, because now the other person feels like, well, why are you getting upset at me? All I said was, you're playing more video games. So it tends to be a little more reactionary, not exclusively so. Being defensive, right? I see you're playing a lot of video games. Oh, so are you my mother now? Why are you watching everything I do? What is it to you? Right? So just defensiveness, the way you know it. Sometimes defensiveness comes because someone made them defensive, right? If someone came at you and said, why are you always doing that? And you just start attacking a person, they're naturally going to get defensive. It's not a free pass, but that's part of the pattern, right? Person A goes too hard too soon. Person B gets defensive, and now we're in this cycle. There are also cases, though, where no matter how I say it, I could say it with the most gentle touch I can. Hey, I'm feeling a little left out. You're playing a lot of video games, and I think that's great because I know you like them. But I'd love to spend some time with you. Maybe this weekend we can. And the person says, oh my God, what is your problem? You're so needy, and gets defensive, right? This unwarranted defensiveness. And so as a counselor, you're trying to figure out, where is this pattern happening, and then later on, why? Is it a learned thing? Is it a personality thing? Stonewalling. What do you think stonewalling is? So stonewalling is if the person says, wow, you've been playing a lot of video games lately, or, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help around with the chores in the house. Stonewalling would be just sort of, it's not defensive, you're not being critical, you're not being contemptuous. It's just kind of a cold checking out. Right? Imagine that person is building a wall around them, no pun intended, but building a wall, and it's just where the person who's speaking feels like they're not being heard. And that's where you get comments like, it's like I'm talking to a brick wall, or it's in one ear and out the other, because the person is not really responding in any way. They're just sort of there. If there were an argument, like a really passionate argument, and one person is just really pouring their heart out, stonewalling would look like they're just kind of standing there watching. There's no real reaction at all. So going back a minute here. So these are really critical issues with communication in couples and in families. And so what we're trying to figure out is which of these is there, why, and how can we kind of reduce that. And that's where you wind up later on going into, is this the way the family communicated? Has it been this way in all relationships? What was it about that comment about video games that made you shut down? Conflict resolution. So how does the couple argue? right? And that's not just communication, but it's also posturing. So is it like as one person gets upset, the other person leaves? Do they start slamming doors? Is there abuse, right? And certainly that's a very serious concern, but it is something we need to explore. Is there any kind of hitting or abuse in there? Is there name calling? Is there power over or gesturing? How do they resolve conflicts? So, on that note, thinking about domestic violence, right? What do we see? We see a pattern where there's the honeymoon period, there's conflict, there's abuse, then there's an apology, and then the honeymoon phase again, and we go around and around and around in the circle. Same thing with couples without domestic violence, right? There is a pattern. It just doesn't have the domestic violence, right? It might be that there's everything's fine, then there's jabbing, and then there's name calling, and then there's drudging up the past, and then there's a break, and then there's an apology, and then we're back in the honeymoon phase. Does this happen over and over and over? And this is a really, really critical aspect of couples counseling. You will spend most of your time trying to figure this out, trying to figure out this pattern. And what do people argue about? Is it the same argument over and over and over? And that's what I mean here. Are the problems resolvable or perpetual? Perpetual problems are the ones that keep coming up, right? Or it's maybe a long-lasting issue, such as like a death in the family, or did you, couples that struggle with, one person struggles with an addiction. Is it something that's always kind of there? Financial problems, right? Sometimes we can't help the circumstances we're in. Are they resolvable? Meaning it's a problem, not minimizing it, but is it things like, are they things like you don't help out around the house enough, right? Because that's something that can resolve. Ideally the other person would increase their workload, or the other person comes to an understanding of, well, they actually do help out. They just don't help out the way I want them to. Is it, I don't like that he doesn't reply to my texts and my phone calls, or whatever it is, but there's a more specific issue with a finite set of solutions. Commitment. So this is important. Like, if you take nothing else away, take this away. When you start doing couples counseling, the first thing you need to figure out is, do both people want to stay in the relationship? It takes two people to make the relationship work, but it only takes one person to end the relationship, right? So first thing off the bat that you want to do is figure out, and I think the best way of doing it is just to directly ask, maybe separate them and have a couple minutes with each person individually, and asking, what do you want to see with this relationship? Where do you see it going? What do you hope to get out of couples counseling? Because it's going to be a very disappointing road to go down if you invest your time and energy into a couple, and one person invests their time and energy into the counseling, and the other person the entire time is thinking, I'm just kind of done with this relationship. Whether you can leave a relationship for any reason you want. It's good to know what you're up against going into that process. And then from there, if one person says, no, I don't want to do this, then it becomes, I'm not, what do we do with that information? Do you want to have a session, what we call discernment counseling, where you bring in the couple and the focus of attention is on, do we stay together or do we separate? The contract, which makes really the least romantic term for couples counseling, right? So this is over expectations. Excuse me. So, have y'all seen that show, Married at First Sight? So this is where the couples typically like fight and stuff like that. So what is meant by contract is the expectations. What do you expect from your partner? whether it's a marriage or a dating relationship or a partnership. What do you expect from that? What does it mean to be in that relationship, to be exclusive, to whatever? And not only what does the relationship mean, but what are your expectations of your partner? And so this can include values. So these are things like, I expect us to go to church every Sunday. I expect us to make purchasing decisions together. I think of sexual wants and needs, right? I expect sex, or I would like sex on these occasions and things like that. Or I expect spending quality time together. But there are those values, and what happens is when a couple first starts dating, everybody's putting their best foot forward, but it is not always reflective of what you actually are. Like, and this is something that everybody does. So problems come up when it's, this would sound like, well, I thought our relationship would be this way, or you knew when you met me this was important to me, or you told me that this was important to you also. And so now they're coming to counseling saying, I have essentially some kind of unmet need, right? And it's not always a behavioral thing like I want more affection or more intimacy. It could also be, I expected to stay at home with our children, and my partner would have a job, or I thought that we would go travel the world, right? Whatever it might be. I thought we would both be this sort of faith, or we would observe this, that, or the other thing. But something has fallen through, so somebody's need is getting unmet. So what is it? Like, we're trying to figure out what it is, and then what happened. With that, this is where problems come up with the contract. It's not articulated. So essentially a partner, they come and they say, well, I thought we would travel a whole lot. That's important to me. I want to go travel the world and see things. Or another person says, I thought, we would pray together and go on these retreats and go to church, and that's not happening. The first question is, did you ever say that to your partner, or to the partner? Did you know that was important to the other person? And sometimes some people don't clearly articulate how important that is. And sometimes they don't articulate it at all, that that's important to them. And so that can send some mixed signals, but it is a case of, well, I didn't know that's what he wanted. I didn't know that she wanted to do all those things, right? And that would be the best case scenario, because then they're like, oh yeah, we can totally do that. I just didn't know that was, why didn't you tell me sooner, right? That's probably not going to happen. But if someone said, I didn't know, how was I supposed to figure that out, right? And so now you see, we're back to communication. They're not respected or upheld. So this is a person who says, oh, absolutely, like, I'll go with you all the time. Or maybe they even start upholding those expectations, or those needs are being met, and then something happens and it changes. So they know, and it's not being done. And so, and again, there might be a valid reason. Someone who says, I thought I'd travel the world. Well, like, we're not traveling the world because there's a pandemic right now, right? Or even if there wasn't one, we're not traveling because, we have finances that we need to maintain. Complete disagreement, right? So this is kind of like, in spite of clearly knowing our differences, we're going to move forward with this thing. So someone says, my faith is really important. I want to go to church, and you got to go to church with me, and you got to convert. And the other person says, nope, no way, no how. That's not going to happen. And somehow, love springs eternal, and they keep moving forward with the relationship. And now we're just at complete odds, right? I want this, and I want something completely different, and we're in disagreement. And then finally, things change over time, right? So think about yourself, especially if you're in a long-term relationship. Um, think of how you were years ago or when you met your partner and compare to today. People change over time. You continue to grow and develop and such. And sometimes there's also stuff happens, right? I wasn't expecting to experience this loss in my family. I wasn't expecting to find this career that I'm really into, or I wasn't expecting to dislike this, right? People change. And so now it's sort of like, yes, that's, I was able to meet those needs and fulfill that person that way. And now I'm not because things are different, which is very valid. But now we got to figure out what to do with that disconnect. Caring and cohesion. So, caring relates to how one person shows affection to another, right? So, think of those of you that are familiar with the love languages. So, this typically is, I want to know my partner cares for me, and I don't think they do. And the partner saying, no, I love you very much, you're my whole world. But the way that they're showing it is a mismatch, right? And what do we do with that? So this is typically kind of the essentially, how do I know that you love me? How do I know that you care about me? And as the counselor, you might just be saying, trying to help them understand they're not doing it exactly the way that you would like them to, but they do feel that way. And to the other person, it's very clear that you love and care about this person. That this is how they receive it, right? And so trying to find a middle ground in there, but the point is to help them understand how they care. And there could be different reasons for not showing care, right? That could be a cultural factor. It could just be a learned issue, growing up in a very cold household versus growing up in a very affectionate household where you're always doting on somebody. Cohesion would be the sense of closeness between people, right? And so this is the case where even if there was a lot of caring, someone's really affectionate to you, do you feel connected to that person? And this is the heavy lifting part, right? Because if you're doing couples and you get to that point and you ask, do you feel connected to your partner? And they say, no, I don't. That can be difficult for the partner to hear. And so what happened? Did you ever feel close with them? If you did, what was that like and what changed? If you never did, then how did we get so far into this? What do you need to feel closer? And this is where, all the unresolved stuff starts coming up. Ever since we moved, it's been really difficult, or ever since we had a baby, or ever since whatever happened, it's been difficult. But trying to figure out the connection between the individuals. Character, which really just means the individual attributes. Because remember, everybody brings stuff into a relationship. This is where you're focusing on the two individuals. So the person who comes and maybe they have a diagnosis, they have family issues, they have a medical issue, whatever it might be. But now we're looking at the individual aspects because we all bring our stuff into these relationships. So it's light individual counseling. Culture. Oh boy. Yeah. So cultural differences, right? And misunderstandings. So this is where we see differences. The first thing that most people think of is differences in religion or spirituality, but it can also be ethnicity, country of origin, political differences, disability, all sorts. So think of that addressing model that you probably went over in multicultural, all those different factors. And where is there an intersection or an impasse? And sometimes it's just not understanding the difference. And so, certainly, not to overshare, I can attest to that. My wife is Latina. And so it's one thing to acknowledge your cultural differences, to say, I'm white and my wife is Latina. And then it's another thing to, you're in the relationship and you say, well, I thought the only difference was X, Y, and Z, or I thought this, it's a misunderstanding. And so you need to kind of pull those differences together, help them understand. And also it's coming to realize how severe are these differences. And so essentially what I'm asking the couple is this a deal breaker, right? That we are of different religions, that we are that this is the expectation from my culture of what a man or woman does, or how a relationship should be. Is this something that can be resolved, or is it going to be one of those perpetual problems that we spoke about? And this is where it can be really helpful to have to, for you, the counselor, you want to consult. And is there a cultural leader or a cultural expert that you can consult with, or even pull into the counseling session? You go over all the consent stuff, of course, but bringing them in to help understand, or help the couple understand, the differences. Oh, children. I'm just joking. They don't ruin anything. They're great. Most of the time. And so kids, this can be difficult, right? Do you want kids versus no kids? Inability to have kids, right? I worked with a young guy years ago who, he and his wife had been trying to conceive for a very long time. Found out that he is not able to have children for a medical reason. And so it really deteriorated. It messed up the relationship, because it was such a want for his partner to have children. And so it's really hard. And it's hard on the other person too. Like, I really love this person, but I also really want kids. And then think of other aspects of having children, right? And that the issues range from things like, how are we going to discipline our kids, to the importance of education, the importance of jobs, how, tough love versus wanting to kind of dote on them. All these different issues with children, it can be overwhelming. And then also just having a child there, right? The fact that there's another person to take care of, especially in the first couple years, where the sleeping through the night, how it changes the dynamic in the house, and feeling like I have no privacy, and all the other stuff that comes up with having children, which is normal, but not every couple is able to healthfully or productively manage those changes and those differences and things like that. And finally, so those were the 8 C's. I want to end this discussion with sexual issues in couples, because this will come up. So certainly this can be a very sensitive topic, both for couples and for counselors. I think it's a good idea to kind of think about how you as a counselor would handle issues, whether it's in couples counseling or individual, handle issues that make you uncomfortable, right? And so in this case, if you're someone who feels kind of squeamish or uncomfortable discussing sexual issues, noting what those thoughts and those feelings are. And for other people, it might be, I have a hard time talking about trauma. I might have a hard time talking about addiction. But those issues that make you uncomfortable, trying to figure out, because it will make you a better, more inclusive counselor. So I say all this, the topic of sex is always a sensitive one. And remember, you're in the position of power in that counseling relationship. And so if you're uncomfortable, it's going to make it even more difficult for your client to be open. All right. So what issues regarding sex do you think come up in couples counseling? And so you probably guessed differences in frequency, right? One person wants sex more often than the other person wants it, and that probably is at the top of the list. It might be is how satisfying is it, or what one person wants. Um, Issues around trauma, right? One person, remember we talked about the individual stuff that everybody brings in. And so these are some of the issues that will come up, and there's probably many other ones as well. So issues in sexual assessment. Do you think counselors struggle, or new counselors struggle with taking a sexual history? Because that is a really important aspect if you're dealing with sexual issues, and if not in couples, if you're doing individual counseling and sex was the presenting concern, or the person brought that up as a salient theme, we need to take a sexual history, and that does include questions like, how many partners have you had? When did you start having sex? Have you had any unintended consequences, like a sexually transmitted infection or an unintended pregnancy? Talking about trauma. And what is difficult about counseling for sexual concerns? And it's that it can be kind of taboo. It makes the client feel very vulnerable. They're sharing with you on a good day without sexual issues or sexual needs and things like that. A client is being very vulnerable with you. They're telling you their thoughts and their feelings and all of that. And that's a lot. When we introduce the topic of sex with it, it becomes even more vulnerable, and it makes the person feel even more uncomfortable, or possibly uncomfortable. And if you're, back to my earlier point, if you're there and you're uncomfortable, your client will know, and that's going to embed the issue even further. But it's that sex is kind of a taboo topic. It's very private. It is an intimate act. And so here's this person sharing with you not only lots of detail about something that's inherently very intimate, but their problems with it. So I kind of said this earlier. When the topic of sex comes up, what we're wondering is their sexual history. And what I always caution new counselors about, with if you're exploring sexual history and wants and needs with a client, always have a goal in mind. These are not questions that you just kind of randomly ask. These are really private. Everything in counseling is private, yes. These are especially private. And so you ask with a certain intention. And when I've had to do this, I let the person know, I'm not asking just out of curiosity. There's a benefit to knowing this and explaining it to them, to let them know that I'm not just sort of morbidly prying into their sex life, but we're wondering, when did they start having sex? Have they ever been sexually assaulted? Have they ever been abused? How many sexual partners have they had? The unintended effects, whether it's a sexually transmitted infection or unintended pregnancy. But on top of that, have you ever been pregnant? Have you ever had an abortion, a miscarriage, so on? Have you ever enjoyed sex? Right? And so we're asking those questions with the goal of trying to identify where's the disconnect with your client or one of the people in this relationship and their sexual fulfillment or wants or needs. So what we're trying to do is define the problem, right? What is it? It's that, I want sex more often than my partner does, or I'm not able, it's not good. I love my partner very much, but sex is not satisfying anymore. But we need to identify what is the problem. And this is something that's really difficult, especially if you're doing it in the context of couples counseling, because someone might wind up feeling like they are inadequate. And, certainly we wouldn't want that, but it doesn't change that there is a problem here. So it can be difficult. And you take your time. Silence is your friend at this point. Is the problem lifelong or primary? What do you think those terms mean? I mean, the lifelong one is kind of a giveaway, right? Has it always been this way? Have you always had this problem? Have you never been able to achieve orgasm? Have you always struggled with erectile dysfunction? Have you always been scared to be intimate? It's always been that way with other partners, or as long as you can remember. Or primary, or contextual might be a better word. It's happening now, right? It was not always this way, but it started when fill in the blank. Is it generalized, right? So every time I try to be intimate, or every time my partner and I engage in sex, it happens, or is it only specific? It's only when X, Y, and Z happens, or I'm only able to enjoy it under these conditions. I can only do it after I have a few drinks, or after I smoke, right? Is it bound to a specific situation? And then we're getting into what is the meaning behind sex. And this is not shade to like psychoanalytic, but it's not this big deep thing. It's, what is the meaning behind sex? What meanings could there be? Yes, for some people it is the sensation, the physicality of it, how it feels, the pleasure behind it. For other people it might be the sense of connection, right? Sex is important to me because it's a sense of connection with my partner. Or on the flip side of things, sex is scary because it is a very vulnerable and intimate act, and I don't like being that way with other people, right? So what is it about sex that is scary or important or great or bad? What is there, right? What is the meaning behind the problem? And this is hard. So I'll use a stereotypical example. If we think about men who have erectile dysfunction, what does it mean that you have erectile dysfunction? And there's probably a better way of asking this question than, hey, what does that mean to you? But the response might be, it means I'm less of a man because I can't maintain or achieve an erection. For women who can't reach orgasm for one reason or another, they might feel, well, it makes me feel like I'm missing out. For their partner, they might feel like, well, I'm not a good partner or a good lover because I can't bring my partner to climax, right? So how is this disconnect or this problem interfering with the relationship? And then finally, what are the expectations of sex in the relationship, right? What does one person want, and what are their expectations? And it goes back to the expectation slide that we talked about. What does one person want? What are their thoughts around it? And comparing it to their partner. And that's going to do it for this PowerPoint. I hope this was interesting. I'm going to show you all how to do an Imago. I posted those worksheets on Blackboard. I hope you find them interesting. I hope this was helpful. And I will talk to you again soon in the next video. I hope everyone is well. And you guys take care. Bye-bye.